Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot Podcast. This is going to be a really fun conversation. We're going to explore international schools, which have just grown exponentially over the last 20 years. And with me today is James McDonald. He's the director of the International School of Brussels. I was actually recently on a podcast that he runs, and that was a lot of fun. And so we're like, hey, come on over to mine and let's talk about international schools, because I think this is going to be really instructive for US based schools, especially boarding schools who do a lot of recruitment internationally. I think that there's some interesting nuggets that they'll take away from this conversation. So we're going to get into it. But before we do, James McDonald, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, it's great to see you and great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm really excited for this, and we're going to get into it in just a second. But before we do, can you introduce yourself and the International School of Brussels?
Yeah, I'm James McDonald. I'm currently the director of the International School of Brussels. I've been here for 6 years. And before that, I worked in quite a number of countries, including Japan for 14 years. So when I first graduated, becoming a teacher, thought, hey, let's go overseas for a year. And the next thing you know, we were there. We had 3 kids in Japan. Was in Thailand for 3 years, in Bangkok, in the Middle East, in Dubai for 4 years, and now 6 years here. So it's been quite the journey, and this is the 3rd school I'm ahead of, and I've also been at the group level when I was in the Middle East overseeing multiple schools. So it's been a lot of fun being international and in education, and I think there's so many parallels between the U.S. independent school sector and the international, but also these differences, which are just, I think, great to explore. So looking forward to today.
Yeah, this is going to be cool. I mean, it's funny though. I was just listening to your career trajectory, and it's like you're kind of moving across the country, across the globe, as your career progressed.
Yeah, it's like we start in Japan and Thailand, and if you know the geography, Dubai, and then Brussels.
Yeah.
I'm planning actually next year to take a bit of a retirement year, and I'm going to be spending part of the year in North America. So I've actually done the circuit.
Keep up with me, right?
I know. So,
well, I can't think of a better person to talk to about international schools. Clearly, you've led multiple schools. You've dedicated your career to this space. And one of the things that, when I was back at EMA, we did a lot of research into international schools, and it was really fascinating to see how they have exploded in numbers over the last 20 years. I think, if I remember correctly, it was like 2,000 schools in 2000. And what's the number that we're at today? Is it over 13,000?
yeah, it depends how you count them.
Yeah.
Does that little preschool that teaches in English in some downtown Asian city, does that count? But many estimates are around 14,000 international schools globally now. So it's a huge number.
Yeah, that's a massive growth. So I'm curious, let's start there. Like, what drove that growth?
It's interesting because I think one thing we're seeing, and this is some of my own personal view, but we have absolutely seen a big shift from it being driven by the expatriates, the expats like myself, grew up in Canada, move overseas. Now, of course, I'm working in these schools, but you have a lot of business people historically that would get moved around, or diplomats, and that's what the original international schools catered to. Where I'm at now, Brussels, 1952, just after the war, we still cater to 30% diplomats, 30% expats. We have 128 kids from the U.S. Embassy here, right? So we're one of these traditional schools. Yeah. But we've also seen, even in Brussels, over the last decade, about 10 new international schools that have opened up. And as is the case here, as we see elsewhere, in 80% of the growth now is from for-profit institutions. So these are organizations that have been set up to make a profit through education. And many have wonderful sort of approaches to their governance and putting kids first. But in the for-profit sector, there's also other incentives that are worked into it, which makes this quite a dynamic area. And we also are seeing now 40% of international schools are a part of a group, and private equity has played a huge role in driving that through major.
James, can you define what a group is? Because I'm not sure all my listeners will know what that means.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of like it sounds. It's a network of schools that are under one corporate umbrella. So there's some big ones. When I was in the Middle East, I worked for an organization called GEMS, which at the time, by some measures, was the biggest in the world. And there's also things like Nord Anglia. That's another one, largely British schools, at least historically. But these things have massive valuations. We're talking up to tens of billions of dollars of valuation from a network of, say, 100 schools, which will have maybe 80 countries represented in it. So when we say group of schools, we're talking about something that might be even traded on a stock exchange in London. These are big companies, and they will run these almost like a school district would be the closest thing to compare it to. But every year they add 10 more schools through acquisitions.
And what's interesting about about their model, and so this is just an observation that I had. So, tell me if I'm reading it the wrong way,
Yeah.
but they offer schooling options at different price points. Like they have different tiers almost, right?
Yeah. Well, let me try to break that down a little bit. So when we say international school, it's such a wide
Yeah.
bucket. I even alluded to it earlier. And so we're talking to a U.S. independent school, audience here.
100%.
But just so you know that there's U.S. independent schools with the title American on them. There's also a lot of other schools with the word British in them.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one of the biggest exports out of the UK is their educational system. It's high quality British curriculum. You'll see it in certain areas of the world. There's also things like IB. In many places, you have a lycée français, the French school or a German school, and everything in between. Right. So when we say international school, we're talking about a very big, wide range of curriculum options. But then what you see, and to your point earlier, is the price point. So where I am at here, we're about 60,000 US per year in tuition. We're certainly at the high end, but we have other schools that are in Brussels here that are maybe a fifth of that, right? So they're catering to different audiences. They're international schools. They attract teachers from different places. They have different programs, but they really run the full gamut. You have the same with independent schools, right? You have some that are going to be much more economical for people. Others that really charge extremely high, but they're trying to produce the value for that, right?
So you're saying here, actually, you'd be surprised at how schools, regardless of, whatever program services that they offer, there's like a clumping of tuition price points, which is a really fascinating, thing to unpack, at least over here.
I know you're interviewing me, but tell me about that. Because I've always understood you have in New York, you'll get the 80,000 per year. And we certainly quote that to our boards every now and again as an anchoring effect. But what tell me about the clusters there, and let's compare that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, in the US, one of the things that's been so interesting over the last 10 years is there's just been, and I'm going to ask you about this on the international side in a second, but
Yeah.
like there's just been this proliferation of choice for families. You could public school, obviously, charter schools, magnet schools, online schools, micro schools, independent schools, parochial schools. Like we've never had more options as parents for our children. And so as you're looking at that spectrum of free, the public schools to, most expensive, which typically is like the independent school sector. Yes, there are like inexpensive choices kind of in between. Now, the market that I typically work with is that kind of independent school market, right? So the schools that are part of the National Association of Independent Schools, that's kind of the type of schools that I tend to listen to this podcast and whatnot. And, I don't have like raw data in my head, so I can't like cite a report or anything of that nature. But, just anecdotally, as I'm talking to schools or I'm looking at schools, depending on if you're a school of 200 versus a school of 1,500, you're going to have different value propositions. You're going to be able to offer different services and experiences, but the price points are typically pretty close to one another. And so it creates this really interesting dynamic and challenge for schools to be able to say, okay, yeah, the school down the street has 5x more students, and they offer all these things, but like we're charging the same, but we offer like a limited scope of what they can offer, but like we do it really well and we differentiate in that way.
And your value proposition, smaller campus,
100%, right? Yeah. Like you're dialing in on those value propositions. And for a long time that worked. I think what we're finding now though is, not only are you trying to differentiate from, your local independent school competition, but you got all these other options now too. And so it's driving lots of pressure on the business model because we have to up the transformation that we promise families, which by that, I mean, offering more services, doing more things like adding, more, programs, signature programs, what have you. And it's just putting pressure on the cost side because we just typically don't generate enough revenue to fully capitalize. It's just it's a very different model than, what I've come to learn about international schools.
Yeah, we talked a bit about that when you were on our podcast
Yeah.
too, and I was so interested. Thanks. I know you're kind of interviewing me, but I'm learning from you, so I appreciate you
No, it's the best
going
kind
down
of
that.
thought. I love it. It's great.
Yeah. So let me give you an example, and for the audience, listen, I find this stuff fascinating. So stop me at any point. But when I worked in the Middle East, one thing that was so fascinating about the group that I worked at, this GEMS Education, was that we offered different curriculum types and different price points. Many schools kind of are one trick ponies. They'll offer a price point. They'll offer this curriculum, and they just replicate that model in big cities around the world, right? But GEMS was different. We had schools in our portfolio that offered an Indian style curriculum for about $1,000 per year, maybe 2,000, all the way up to 50,000 per year for an IB, full IB school with all the bells and whistles, really low teacher student ratios, and everything in between. So you had you would call it mid market, which would be really economical, big class sizes, often British curriculum or Indian curriculum. You can run those with much lower headcounts. Those curriculums are designed that way. The American school was the next American curriculum would be the next step up. And then you had your IB curriculum, which would be the most expensive. You need more teachers to deliver that. And so your value proposition changes, your class size changed. In some schools we'd walk through, you'd go see the gym and it's a concrete floor. And then you had a wood sprung floor in the top end. I mean, it was
Yeah.
a little bit like you go onto an aircraft and you you walk through the first class, business class, comfort class, and the economy. And we've essentially offered all of these things because people in Dubai needed to send their kids to school. It's tax free in Dubai, but you have to decide where you spend your money. And so education was a big spend for people. So really, it was the sort of thing. Whatever curriculum you want, whatever price point you want, it was there,
Yeah.
and it was a really fascinating setup. It's like an economics textbook with education as an example.
Yeah, that is absolutely, it's kind of mind blowing in many ways to me. Like just thinking about how you have one company being able to drive different educational options across this vast portfolio. And, I think it's a really good signal for just the overall growth in that market. Like what you said, 2,000 to 14,000 today by some accounts. And I guess what that suggests to me is families in country have kind of similar experiences that we're having here in the US, just a lot of choice. And I know US schools have spent decades and continue to recruit internationally, but it's getting more challenging. Now there are a whole set of reasons for that. There's
Yeah.
geopolitics, there's all kinds of stuff, there's price, but I also have to, in my mind, I'm like, okay, well, part of this also is families just have more options so that they can get that American diploma, the IB diploma, the British diploma, and then go off to institution of higher education at a price point that's a lot less than what you might spend sending your kid to the United States. So, like, what do you think that am I reading that? Like, what's your
You're
read on
spot
that?
on.
Yeah.
So one thing that's interesting, let me shift over to Thailand now as an example. So when I was in Thailand, I was at one of the last schools, big not-for-profit international schools to be founded. It was the New International School of Thailand. It was founded by UN parents in 1992.
Hmm.
And so most of the schools that have come into Thailand after that, almost all of them actually are for-profit, and there's now hundreds. Well, the reason why hundreds of schools have opened and they're hiring American teachers and British teachers and Canadian teachers to come in is to offer essentially an independent school network in these countries. So when people say international school in Thailand, you're essentially talking about Thai kids going to a school where they'll have Thai classes, but they'll have a lot of their classes taught in English. Because if they're taught in English, then they can go to school abroad and it gives them roots and wings. And there isn't a strong independent school system there. You don't have international schools in any number in the US because you've got great independent schools, right? You don't need them. But in other parts of the world, particularly where the economies have been developing, you're seeing this emerging middle class that want options for schooling. So what that means is you have some really high quality schools. So when I was in Thailand, I think most people would agree it was a very high quality school that we had, but we were also the most expensive. So extremely wealthy Thai people would send their kids there. And what we saw was that these families in previous generations, those kids would go to the US for their education. But we thought we did a pretty good job because very few left us. But 10, 15 years ago, they would have gone to the US or the UK to finish their education and then try to go an Ivy League or to the Oxbridge. And you're seeing a drive of quality and an increase of what we call international schools. It's actually an independent school network. using foreign teachers to bring in their expertise to raise the level of education. And that's really been the model. And a bunch of business people have caught on to this and opened these small schools that are getting gobbled up by bigger groups and private equity. And that's it in a nutshell, I think.
Well, and even some U.S. independent schools, right? I mean, if you look at Chadwis, Korea, you look at my alma mater, Brewster Academy in Spain, like there are independent schools that are investing in creating, international options in country. Now, the model that they're using differs, right? Some of them are licensing their diploma, others are creating, startup funds to be able to build, for-profit versions of their nonprofit institute. Like, there's just a lot of different models, but it is really fascinating to me that all of this investment has been happening all over the world. I mean, like you said, UK, like their biggest export is education.
Yeah. Yes, it's got a very well-established reputation for that. The other thing that's interesting, I mean, with the U.S. model, the thing that I find fascinating, there is no thing like there is no American curriculum. It's state-driven. It's at the local level. There's so many decisions. You don't have curriculum. You have standards. The British system, it's one system across the entire country. And so what makes the British attractive is that all the exams are baked into it, all the key stages, all the curriculum, all your teacher training, and everything's basically aligned. Whereas if you have an American school, you get to choose a lot of things and a lot needs to go into your curriculum design. You have a lot of choices, which is brilliant. But it also means it can be very variable. So some of the weakest schools would adopt an American curriculum in certain countries because they wouldn't be accountable and they'd avoid a British one. Because the British, you'd have to do the exams at different stages. With an American one, well, some of the flexibility was there, let's say. And these are in parts of the world you might not be surprised to hear they would want local wealthy people being able to influence their child's grades.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So, but all of this is just so interesting.
What is driving families' choices now, internationally? I know that's like a really broad question because every market, every country is going to be different. But, I think for independent schools, it would be really helpful to begin to get a feel for, is it prestige? Is it price? Is it access to US, UK, Australian, Canadian universities? Like, what do you think is driving choices for families in order to either invest in sending your child to the US or finding an option in country?
So, as I mentioned here in my current context, we have quite a few expats,
Yeah.
the business people, and they're on temporary assignments or diplomats. We're not for profit. But we've done quite a bit of market research into ours, and I think this is representative of a broader trend. The expats tend to be sort of mission aligned, want a safe, happy place for their kids with good quality, and they could really meet friends and they're going to fit in.
Yep.
The local families that are coming are very wealthy Belgian. We have some very high profile people here at the school. And essentially what they're looking for here is a trade. It's a return on investment, if you want to be crude with it. Of course, they want all that other stuff. But if they're going to spend this much money in the final 4 years of school, what do I get at the end of it? They're smart business people. They know that there's the networks that they'll be involved in, but more importantly, which universities are they going to go to afterwards, and how are you going to provide that launching pad for them? In the U.S. sector, and I've seen this with some of our parents here, some of our board members throughout, they will send their kids to boarding schools because they know those are the best paths for getting into those top universities. And if they get their children into those schools, the world's going to be open for them for the rest of their lives, especially in some places like Thailand was a big issue. Anyone with an Ivy League education in Thailand was at a different place in the society when they came back. And so what the parents want, and what I would say to your audience is the selling point is, if you can provide that support for them getting into that top school and you make that pitch, that is going to have an incredible sort of currency for these families. It's not everybody, but these wealthy families that have the wherewithal to be able to do this, probably many of them went to the US themselves for education and be looking to give their kids as much advantage as they possibly can. And
So
that's the key.
and that outcome, I think, sounds like that outcome has, I think, schools have figured that out for a while. So that's just consistent, right? Like, it's still about pathway to high quality, higher education opportunities in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And it depends on the family, but ultimately, particularly when you see, because what's driving overseas, there's a lot more wealth in these countries than there used to be. And people, if you traveled 20 years ago and you were in some of these Asian cities, whatever you have in your head is gone. These places, I tell my Canadian friends and all the rest that so many of these Asian cities that you might have thought of as being not as wealthy as Canada, that's not the story anymore.
Yeah.
I mean, Shanghai now is unbelievable in the last 10 years, how much it's even changed.
Let's talk about China for a second, because, for a long time, China was sending, lots of kids from China were coming to US schools for, a lot of the reasons we talked, open up their futures, find, build networks in the United States, experience American education, go to great quality colleges and universities. But, that pathway seems to be narrower now. Like, there's just fewer kids, and, there are a lot of reasons for that. But one of them is, the proliferation of international schools in China. And, I think if you had if you looked at it like and generalized it, the assumption would be if a family's come from China, they come from immense wealth. That's not always the case, because you have, under the one child rule, you would have one child and both sets of grandparents, and the parents were making sacrifices to send their kids to the United States. Now, there are opportunities in China where you can get an IB diploma, you can get an American diploma, you can, whatever you want. There's pretty much an option. And some of them are, affiliated with brand name schools in, foreign in the UK or the US or whatnot. So I'm curious, like, what do you see? What are your colleagues talking about when it comes to China now?
Well, I mean, you almost can't remove it from some of the other things that are happening. The politics in the US right now is partly what's happening in China. And one thing I think people should be aware of, and maybe I can say this as a Canadian, is there is a real wariness for anyone to travel to the US right now, and a real wariness to put your kids there when you're not sure about their security, let's say with visas and that sort of thing. And that is, maybe it's a rational fear, maybe it's not, but it's something that I think is going to become increasingly a pressure for US independent schools, is just that idea of how welcome foreign students may be in the US. So there's that. China in particular, though, I think has been increasing the quality of its educational programs dramatically, quality of its universities. The QS rankings of top universities. If you look at that over the last 10 years, it's remarkable. I think 7 of the top 25 are now Asian. There's 2 of the top 10 in Singapore.
Yeah.
It's different. Your Ivy Leagues are not in there anymore. And what this means is that people are no longer looking for the best schools to be in the US. They are actually really strongly considering staying in Asia. And some of the numbers are really backing that up. So I think you've got a couple of geopolitical tensions there, which you need to consider in your marketing and approach, but also kudos to that part of the world. They've really invested heavily and had strategies for decades to improve the quality of universities, which means it probably makes more sense to stay than to go to the traditional US or UK route, or Canada or Australia.
Right.
So I think those things are really, really playing up from the Chinese point of view.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I want to pivot, because when I came on your pod, we talked. I was talking about the gap. The revenue we bring in tuition, and then what it costs to run the school. And I was telling you how, based on data here, it's about 28% every year that schools have to close the gap. And like, it was pretty. You could not fathom what I was talking about.
I still think you're speaking a different language when you hear this.
Yeah.
Keep going though.
Yeah. And James, can you give a plug for your pod real quick?
Yeah, we have it. It's called Where's Your Head At? And 3 of us during COVID, we wanted to stay connected, and we're basically 3 heads of school. And we've just been, I think we don't do nearly as well as you. I think we're at our 30th episode now. So, yeah.
Well, it's a great group, and it was a lot of fun, but we probably spent more time on that topic than anything else.
Yeah.
So for folks who are listening here, like, talk about what the business model looks like for international schools, because that concept of the gap just doesn't exist, right?
Yeah. So I'm flabbergasted. Let me just put this in terms as somebody, I've got a business background. And so this is a little bit of my niche, if you like, from a leadership perspective on the business side of things. And to run budgets and present budgets in front of a board, if you're running a deficit here, I'd just be sent back, go produce another budget and don't come back until we have 5%.
Right. 5% profit.
No, 5% surplus, I guess we call it. And this is at a not-for-profit school. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. So it's basically revenues minus expenses, and assume 90+% of your revenues are going to be tuition related.
Yeah.
Right. So we may have some stuff in the cafeteria and the buses and all the rest, but the general model is 90+% from tuition. And that's just your straight head count times the tuition levels. And then your expenses will be about 70% up to 80% in not-for-profits of staffing costs.
Yeah.
Right. And then the rest is almost details. Right. So that's the basic model. And we would aim for about a 5% margin. And there's no agreement. We're all independent schools. But generally speaking, if it's a 10% margin, people don't want a fee increase. And if it's less than that, then you're running a deficit, and that's not sustainable. So 5% seems reasonable. At the for-profits, and this is going off more general figures and not necessarily in my own specific context, but in the for-profit, it's pretty well known that the schools will run 25% margins at least. And in some different models, it can push up to 50% margins. And these are particularly when you have a school group that can amalgamate and have different ways of shaving costs off, where you don't have specialist teachers. The teachers are all teaching classes and they're maxed up to their level. It's a very efficient model. You'll have as many kids as you can in a class. And this really increases the revenues. So this is the model. And by the way, that's driven by private equity, who's looking at spreadsheets somewhere in New York or London and telling educators how to meet their quarterly targets.
What does that look like? Let's look at it from the nonprofit perspective. What are the pressures that you all are feeling right now in the model?
It's very difficult to be consistent in terms of our projections on how much revenue we're going to bring in, because we have to set a budget in the spring. And to put this in context, we have about 1,300 kids here in Brussels, and we have 300 to 350 new kids every year. So the churn is about a quarter of our population. If I have 10% less students next year, that's a massive impact on the budget, because that's 30 kids, right? Times about 60,000 a year. You did the math on that. It's close to 2 million, right? Like this is huge. And the next thing you know, that 5%. So if we're 10% off on our estimate, and this is the HR department over there, the embassy over here makes an adjustment, it's pretty easy to happen, right? And so we really struggle to try to predict where we're going to be next year and make sure we've got those numbers where they need to be in terms of the revenue, because we've locked into the expenses much earlier because of contracts, especially in Europe, because of the nature of the contracts here.
Yeah.
That's the big one. Yeah.
Do you find that competition is becoming an increasingly big part of the challenge?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that we have so many more for-profits coming in. Where we are, the way we would view the competition would be much more in the lower school area of the school, where you would have substitutes at half the price. We don't really have much direct competition that's new. We have a very good British school here as well, but there's not much new competition at the upper level, because we're so good on the IB diploma and the AP and the other pathways that we have. Those are really hard to compete against us. Yeah. At the lower school, people are really wondering, am I going to spend that much money for that many years? And so I think I've seen numbers in different schools that elementary is becoming a much harder value proposition.
Interesting.
Yeah. People pay the ROIs at the top of the school for them in their head. Yeah.
Got it. If you were advising a U.S. independent school today, what is the most important misunderstanding that they may have about the international school market and its impact on U.S. independent schools?
I think the first misunderstanding might be they may have some experience with an international school, and they're going to assume that's what international schools are. So whatever you might think it is, if your sample size is relatively small, believe me, it's a much bigger world. I think the other thing that may be worth stating is that when you say international schools, and as I mentioned earlier, think independent school network in a country offering an international curriculum. So if you're trying to target students that are going to leave their home country and come and stay on a boarding capacity on your side, you have much better local competition, which isn't really local. It's the international school teachers providing education in that context, in that city probably, that used to be a source of people coming over for boarding schools. So I think that would be, there really are, and they're better quality options than they were. And I think every year that's improving, because you really had a lack of good educational options in host countries 30 years ago. And it's simply not the case now.
James McDonald, Director of International School of Brussels. Thank you for sharing. This has been amazing. If somebody wants to contact you? What's the best way for them to do that?
Gosh, probably LinkedIn. I'm
Perfect.
pretty active on there. So yeah, it's quite a few James McDonalds out there, but there's not that many geeky guys that in a suit in Brussels. So you can probably find me. Yeah.
I'll make sure to link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes.
Great.
James McDonald, thank you again. This has been terrific. For those of you who are part of Moonshot Lab, hang on. The extended version of the podcast will start in just a second. But again, James, thank you so much.